Carlos, a pleasure to talk about the fundraising field guide with you. I'd love to start with a bit of an intro as to why you wrote the book and why you didn't just create one edition, but three.
Yes, exciting. Well, I started off writing a whole bunch of blog posts first. So I would say that the motivation came from the blog posts, and the blog post came from two things. One of them was exploring ideas. There's nothing like writing to explore an idea fully, right? So when you write, the process of writing, you're having to organize your thoughts, and you're going to have to be able to explain and provide the background leading to the thought, the conclusion of the thought, and then sort of the takeaway from the thought. And so a lot of the issues that came up through the day-to-day of early day Seedcamp, which included stuff like how to deal with term sheets, competitive inbound, or any of the usual fundraising issues that people have, and tranches and other things that were notable at the time when Seedcamp started, they made their way into blog posts. And then those blog posts hit a certain volume that I was like, well, maybe I should just aggregate them into a book. And so I think it was like 4 or 5 years worth of blog posts. Then there was about a year and some of editing them together into something that read like a book, and then sort of filling in the gaps that came together into the first edition. And the first edition was quite, I look back and I think there's some great stuff in there, and there's some things that now feel very out of date. And the reason why they fell out of date is because so much has changed in the world from the first edition to now, like just around inflation, COVID, and the number of investors in the ecosystem. And therefore, editions 2 and 3 were required to keep up to date across that journey.
Nice. Love it. Let's dig into some of the questions that you unpack in especially edition three of this book. Let's start just with the typical VC investment process. Could you describe to us kind of the typical process that you see and why it's important for founders to understand the process?
So in the book, there's a metaphor I use, and it's about dating. Some people have sort of views on that as a metaphor, but I do think it's a good one because dating is an example of something where you get first impressions. And if you get the first impression wrong, it's very hard to recover, right? It's just generally very hard to recover. And so when you're going fundraising, a challenge is how do you make sure your first impression is the best impression? And so part of a book like the Fundraising Field Guide is to help you understand the elements of a first impression when you speak to an investor. Everything from how you communicate to how you reach out to how you structure your round or the process itself and what you say and you shouldn't say. And all those little questions are things that I wanted to unpack because ultimately what I'd love for the reader to take away is how to think about what is a first impression with an investor and how even little things that you do in advance of a meeting can lead up to and set you up for a very good first impression.
Let's talk about prerequisites for a successful VC fundraise, right? We see founders who have just an idea, an MVP, or already revenue generating. There's a ton of different types of companies that are raising a first institutional round. For all of these companies, what are some of the key things that you need before you go out and fundraise?
So I think when the first edition was written, a lot more traction was needed to really showcase things. And traction is everything from your team to the product build and everything. I think what's happened since first edition to third edition is that now you can fundraise if you're a founder who has maybe started a company before or you've left a startup that's quite notable. You can almost fundraise without having anything. You'll have simply people reach out to you, investors reach out to you on LinkedIn and say, hey, do you want to take our money? Right. And so it's funny, like the prerequisites have changed. I don't know that there is uniformity in what the prerequisites are. That said, I think that there's quite a lot of value to think about a lot of things before you take a first meeting. I think that if you're meeting with an investor and you really can articulate what you're building, I think that seems kind of daft. But some people still, hey, look, I'm exploring in this area. And that's sometimes good enough, especially if you've done this before and you come from that area. If you're a PhD in machine learning, it's presumably you're going to explore something in that area, right? So the irony is the criteria for having something has gone down. But I think that the less you can defend your pedigree, if you will, like where you come from, what you've done, and why you're successfully going to build this company, the more you need to justify it with some sort of product, some sort of team, some sort of components. So it's not for everyone. And in the book, I unpack maybe starting thinking about that And it doesn't hurt if you do have all the criteria for an investor to reach out to you. It doesn't make it worse for you to have all that ready, for you to have your thought about how you're going to acquire customers, to have a plan for how you're going to reach out to other investors, how you're going to create a potential competitive dynamic so that you're not in a disadvantaged terms situation. So all those things are still beneficial for you, even if money comes easily.
One of the things you mentioned, definitely something I've seen, is that venture has become a lot more outbound driven. So investors are much more likely to ping you if you're a stealth founder, even though they don't know what you're building and you're not an exited founder, perhaps. Maybe you're just a really strong operator. What are some of your tips for if you're not getting outbounded by a ton of investors, but you're now raising, you're kind of ready to raise? How do you find those investors?
So finding investors is probably the biggest part of the book and how to manage that. Because as you said, inbound is possible today because of a lot of social media and tools, but it doesn't apply for everyone. I think that's probably the biggest challenge in writing a book like this is that you know that for a group of people, circumstances are going to be very easy. And this is why the dating metaphor is, sadly true, is that for a few people going to, social situation, life is easy. And for everybody else, it's a process that takes time and patience and emotional fortitude. And so that whole process involves usually having to organize the criteria that you're looking for in an investor into a sub list of investors that are investing in what you are doing. So I think probably the biggest mistake people make is that they don't curate the list of investors. They just spam everyone. It's probably the biggest mistake. But once you have a nicely curated list of who you think would be a good match for you, and based on their previous investments, that they have no conflicting investments, there's a blog post we put out that has like a pipeline management for that on a Google Sheet. If you don't even need to read the book to get access to that, it's on Medium, I think. And basically, what you have to then manage is the relationships of outbounding and organizing those conversations into next steps. And it resembles a sales pipeline. It's how to manage a sales pipeline. But where the book probably provides some guidance is in how to best acquire those relationships. Because the problem is that you can't just cold outreach and expect the same level of conversion than if you have some sort of warm link into that investor. So in summary, it's not just how to reach out to people, it's what is the preparation leading up to it, what's the organization of it, and what is the process that you follow based on that organization.
Makes a lot of sense. And yeah, you even mentioned in your book, right? Look through all your contacts on LinkedIn, find that person who has that warm relationship to a VC that you think could be compelled by your vision and reach out that way, right? There's a ton of nifty things that you can do to get better access than just a cold outreach.
Yeah.
So let's say a founder knows they want to raise, they have their top investors in mind, they have a particular link to get to that investor. If you were to give that founder advice when they're building their deck, what are some of the key things that the deck should be addressing? What do you think at the pre-seed seed stage should not even be mentioned in the deck?
What should not be mentioned is less about anything that you're getting wrong. It's more about not overloading the deck, right? Because for pre-seed and seed, there is very little that you can conclusively say about your business. There's so much that's still in flux. So sometimes you can almost look worse off by having so much conviction around so many finer details and points that map out to 5 years in the future. So the irony of this is that you can almost, one thing I talk about is you can calibrate what kind of investor you're talking to depending on what level of detail they expect from you. And that level of detail they expect from you is a function of their experience with the uncertainty of the stage that you're in. And so what you shouldn't put is more a function of discerning between what you should or shouldn't have ready and know at the stage you're in, rather than anything specific that you shouldn't have in there. Of course, there's a quality that you need to have to your presentation. So you shouldn't have bad quality. And then that's a whole different subject of discussion. Like, what is a bad quality presentation, deck, plan, whatever? And what is a good quality? And I think we all know good quality from bad quality when we see it. But sometimes when you're creating it, you can't always tell, right? So those are two little separate points. But let me go back to the first question you asked, which was like, what should be in it? Well, what should be in it is enough clarity to give people a sense for what the idea is, who the people behind it are, how you're going to get customers, and what you need to achieve with the money that you're raising. That's pretty much the bare minimum. Like, of course, there's a lot more to detail to that. Like, tell me about your customer, tell me about the pricing, tell me about the business model. Those are all little extensions of those points, right? But if it's unclear what you're building, kind of not very helpful, is it? If I don't know who your team is, also not particularly helpful. And then if I don't know who you're targeting, maybe a little less necessary, because in some cases, pre-seed, you may not know, right? But does it add credibility if you understand who your customer is and why they might be buying? Man, it does add a lot of credibility. So, it's just something to consider. It sounds kind of basic, but it isn't actually. Those are the details that define that quality.
Yeah, and you spent decades looking at decks, right? So you've really seen the best and the worst when it comes to
Well, you have
deck
to, Kate.
creation.
Come on, you have to.
Yeah, I'm still in the beginning journeys, but yes. You talk about storytelling a lot, and it's personally one of my favorite topics, the human element of storytelling. And you had a great quote from Antonio Damasio, who said, "We're not thinking machines that feel, we are feeling machines that think," which I love that quote. You talked a little bit about deck creation, but the main nuggets that you need to include to make this a valuable conversation with the investor when you present the deck. But what are some of the human elements that you suggest founders bring to really make that story shine?
So one little calibration point here is that people can also tell when they're being manipulated. And so when you tell your story, I think that there's a certain level of authenticity you need, and you shouldn't over push on that in order to create sort of an artificial sense of emotions. So this is where you can't just be obviously telling a story that is entirely around a transactional element and inspire somebody to give you money on the basis of nothing. It doesn't tend to work that well. But on the other extreme of this, you can't ham up something so much that it feels not genuine, and that the way that you're approaching this and the outcome of this is entirely for ulterior motives. And that also breaks trust, which doesn't brings me to the main point. It's like storytelling is to create trust around the authenticity of your emotions towards the project and the customer. And that's kind of like maybe a definition of it, right? So that means that there's a spectrum, like you don't care or you fake care. Both ends of that spectrum are bad, right? So then it becomes, how do you tell an authentic story around why you're building this? And that sometimes comes from the background of your team and how you met or what the issue was. But not everything needs to be prepared like some sort of pre-digested story. And this is probably the issue that's hardest to communicate to somebody is storytelling isn't about storytelling. It's about understanding that there is a relationship between what you're working on, the customer, the person that you're talking to at the moment, and you're telling about your company, your relationship with that idea and how you got there with your colleagues. And some of that can be articulated through a narrative that explains it, but some of it can just be a function of discovery and how you sort of represent that discovery process. And so I'm being intentionally abstract here because I don't want people to walk away from this point and think that what they need to get really good at is crafting some sort of Disney narrative around their startup. That isn't the objective. But the objective is to have people walk away being able to tell your story to somebody else. So maybe that's the best way to describe it is like, if I heard what you said, whichever way it came, not Disney specifically, but some other variant of it, and then I walk away and I hear something very clearly and I structure it so that I can articulate it at a dinner party later, then you've effectively story told. You've effectively communicated what your idea is. So it might be, like the obvious example is, hey, I'm starting this business because I used to work in this industry and I noticed this was broken and this is what I'm building. And my background, my team, we have PhDs in this issue. And so we built it and look, this is how cool it is and how it serves the customer loves it, right? That's the typical arc, right? Now, the atypical arc would be more like you were working on something that the customer, noticed and used the feature, and then you noticed that that feature had an extension with another group of people, and then you sort of deducted that there was something to be built there, and then you became passionate about the fact that it was solving a problem. And so it doesn't always have to feel artificial, like you've created this artificial thing. And so I think where people go wrong is when they try too hard. That's maybe the way to put it. You can mess it up by trying too hard, but you can also mess it up if you don't try to put together all the thoughts about how it came together in a way that somebody else can then represent it for you.
Mm. I love that. I love that. Carlos, in your book, you mentioned the elephant in the room, how to identify it, how to deflate the elephant in the room, the thing that all investors are thinking about when they hear you speak about your company. How do you do that? How do you identify and deflate the elephant in the room? And maybe describe to us what the elephant in the room even means.
Well, this is part of where I feel like go read the book, right? So I'll define it because I think that's important, especially for non sort of US, UK, English speaking people. It might not make sense. Um, the idea of an elephant in the room is that there's something so obvious that if you don't address it, people are distracted, right? So that is a general definition of it. So it would be like, if you and I were speaking and I had a piece of food right here and you were just distracted, how does Carlos not notice he's got a piece of food on his cheek, right? And so everything I would say would be sort of forgotten because you're so distracted. And that happens a lot. Like imagine you're building a social network, and I'm just going to pick on something really easy here. And it just happens to have like I was pitching you, Kate, as a VC, and I said, "Oh, I'm building a social network. It's limited to 160 characters, and you can like it, and you can reshare it with your people who follow you, and it's great." And you in your head, you're thinking, "Wait, isn't that Twitter X or whatever it's called today?" It's like, isn't that just X? And you're going to keep on thinking that as I continue to tell you about it. And I could have easily dealt with that much more succinctly by just saying it will resemble some of the elements of X, but this is where it differs. And so that's just dealing with it. It's a simple, and of course, it's more complicated for different things, but I think it's just an awareness that the listener, and this is part of storytelling, is like part of storytelling is understanding where the listener is at the moment they're listening to what you're saying. So what Disney does well with storytelling is it understands the customer, which is usually a certain age group, and then understands where they're coming from, their vocabulary, their emotional state, and then can tell a story that connects with that, right? And the same thing, an elephant in the room is effectively understanding that if you're talking to a VC who's seen every startup in that space, it's very different than one who hasn't. And so if you don't address the elephant in the room, you run the risk of having it completely go the wrong way.
Mhm. And it's an ability to build trust with the investor, right? As soon as you kind of say what's on their mind and just speak openly about it, they have trust in you that you've really got the macro in mind for whatever you're building. Let's talk about raising money. And I think this topic has changed, come from the first, second, now the third edition
Mm.
of your book. How do you know, or how would you advise the founder to think about how much to raise? And maybe before you answer that, is it even important to have a clear ask with respect to how much you want to raise?
Very big questions, Kate. I almost want to hear your answers on this. I know that that's not the scope of this particular chat, but
It's
I'd love
your
to hear
time,
what you
Carlos.
think. Um, but I'd love to hear what you think. This is probably one of the most complicated ones, right? Because it affects so many things. It affects the valuation. It affects how many months you can run the company for. It also affects how you come across. It affects many things. And this is probably the big sticking point. How much should you raise? On top of that, there's some ego associated with it. And we all have an ego. So it's not that anybody who's listening is being accused of having an ego. So we all have an ego, but it's how we manifest it. And sometimes people want to manifest their success through how much they raised. But in this third edition of the book, I talk a little bit about what happens when you've raised too much, right? So it's going to be very hard for me very succinctly in this chat we're having, Kate, to sort of walk through the precise you should raise. And I think that's partially what the book helps for. But I think that there's a bell curve, right? Too little, you run out. But why would anybody raise too little? The reason why sometimes people raise too little is because there's this perception that if you raise less, you can probably get certain people off the fence. It's like, oh, this is a smaller amount, so therefore I will get more people to get on board. That's when you raise too little or you're unable to, right? And so you don't have enough funds to execute. on the other end of the spectrum is raising too much. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing that's changed in version 2 to version 3 of the book. I knew that that was the case when I wrote versions 1 and 2, but nobody had seen it really in the ecosystem. And so it was very hard to talk about it in abstract until what happened post-COVID, when there was a lot of money injected into the system by monetary policy. So one of the things that we do talk about in the book is this idea that if you raise too much money, there's a whole series of repercussions. And so therefore, and those repercussions, I mean, you can read about them, but basically, I mean, an example of one repercussion is that there's a certain sense of pressure that it evaporates. And people are like, well, no, I can instill pressure by having more funds. And to some extent, that's true, but to some extent, others also know the truth. And so therefore, there's expectations about what they should get paid and other things like that on the basis of what they know you raised. And so it creates a lot of second order effects that people sometimes don't want to acknowledge, but they're there and the data shows it. It's like a lot of companies who raise too much money have some issues, and it's a hard thing to talk about, right? And so therefore, raising the right amount of money is, well, how much money do you need to operate to showcase that you've done success on the product and hiring end of things, and that you have some level of product market fit by the time you need to raise again. That's it. That's the succinct answer. And of course, the mathematics of that depend on the company, the sector, and a whole bunch of other things. But, I try to unpack in the book a little bit about how that journey of discovery, and then keeping within the boundaries of not too little, not too much.
Nice. Yeah, there's a lot more that I bet we could discuss on that point. But yeah, to the listeners, absolutely read Carlos's book. You mentioned that kind of the amount you're trying to raise is so intricately linked to the actual valuation, right? I mean, in some ways, your raise amount is an output of, or the product or output of the valuation. What is the biggest determinant of a company's valuation during a fundraise?
So it's a simple equation. Money raised divided by post money equals dilution. And so those three variables are interconnected. I would almost say that the two variables that are most influential, and one's controlled by the market and one's controlled by the founder. The market controls dilution, the founder controls how much money to raise. So we talked about that a second ago about the spectrum. So the spectrum allows you to define maybe a range of how much you could raise, but the market is determining how much dilution is typical for that range. So it's rare that a founder who's starting from zero can raise 200 million in one go. It's just rare. So the dilution there is infinite because nobody's going to ever give you that. And if you're raising very small amount of money, the probability you get is pretty 100%, like $10, probably somebody can give it to you. It's very easy. So you can almost get it for, very little, right? So that's the spectrum, but market isn't just about probabilities of getting funding. Market more specifically is about what level of dilution an investor giving you, or what level of ownership, which is, the equivalent of dilution, what level of ownership an investor who's giving you money is going to expect for the capital they're giving you. So an example of that would be in the 2020s, early 2020s, during COVID, when a lot of companies were getting funded, there was a lot of competition for those companies because the public markets were very hot. So a lot of people went into the private markets. It meant there was a lot of competition. A lot of competition means that investors have to offer more favorable terms. More favorable terms means less dilution. So that means that the valuation is a function of less dilution, right? And therefore, the post money of your company is going to be higher, because even if you fixed the amount of money you're raising, the market is determining that for that amount of money, they can take less, or they should take less equity. And so in a highly uncompetitive market, or one where there's a scarcity of capital, that flips, right? So the market says, well, look, you want that amount of money? There isn't a lot of money around, so it's going to be a little bit more expensive. And so I think that's probably the biggest mystery unpacked about evaluation of companies, is that it isn't some sort of arbitrary thing. It's not something you can calculate through a traditional method that you learn in school. It's a function of the competitiveness of capital at that stage you're in the geography that you're in, and then that married with how much money you're raising. And if your range of money is too much or too little, that will affect the likelihood of you getting that percentage at all, right? Because it'll go from an acceptable tight range to zero because nobody wants to give you money at that valuation. So it's an interesting sort of like step function. It's like, here's this curve of probability and then zero and 100% on both ends, depending on, how much you're asking for and what your expectations are.
Mm. This begs the question, should founders time the market for their fundraise, given how important market dynamics are to their valuation?
You could time the market. You could say, oh, I'm expecting the US government to reduce interest rates, and therefore there's going to be, an explosion of capital. But then you probably missed the market opportunity. You probably missed like 5 startups started in the meantime, and then they acquired all your customers. So I'm not sure that you can time the fundraise in sync with your customer. I think you should probably focus on the customer, succeed, and then the rest will take care of itself. If you're the best company in the sector and the customers love you, you can probably set the terms you want anyway. Nothing will get you the right terms more than being the best. So, maybe focus on that.
Nice. Let's switch tacks a bit. Talk about some of the most common mistakes you've seen founders make at the early stages of fundraising.
I mean, probably we talked about first impressions, right? And so most of the mistakes are first impression mistakes. They come in different types of varieties, right? There's before a meeting or during a meeting or after a meeting. You can make all those mistakes and then pretty much eliminate your chances of raising money very quickly. Some of the mistakes beforehand could be reaching out to a whole bunch of investors, and all of a sudden you get a lot of people talking about your company about how they got spammed. And then all people are like, wait a second, I got that email too, but I have nothing to do with this company. I have nothing to do with that sector, right? You could actually get spam blocked by email providers, and then you go nowhere, right? We get all sorts of funny emails, and I'm sure you do as well, Kate, where you can tell by the formatting that you're like, this is not for me. Like you can just tell from the way it's written that it's like dense, like an email this long that says like, hey, let me pitch everything in bold and blah, and you're like, wait a second, I don't even know what you're doing exactly. And you already bombarded me with sort of too much information that I cannot process within the time frame that I'm going to look at something I don't know. It's unqualified. I don't know who you are and what you're building, and therefore burdening me with all that in one go doesn't get me the incremental buy-in you need. And as humans, we always require incremental buy-in, right? Anywhere you go, this is why movie trailers exist. It's an incremental form of buy-in. Like you can't just like, boom, watch the whole movie in one go. You haven't even no interest in it. It doesn't work. So, it's an interesting one where you have to really calibrate how much you prepare before you meet somebody so that when they meet you, they already bought in. All right. And then, okay. So like fast forward. Now you're meeting them. You can't explain what you do. Well, there you go. Mistake. Or it takes you forever to get to the elephant in the room. You've lost them. There's another mistake. And then after you met them, right? So the first meeting, you found the right investor. You had a great first meeting. A typical mistake after the first meeting is you're unresponsive. Because now the investor's like, oh, this is great. But then all of a sudden, you're incredibly slow to get back to them. They start wondering, is this person a responsive person? Is this person going to be like this with their colleagues? Is this person going to, so there's a whole bunch of things that you can do wrong before a meeting, during a meeting, and after a meeting. And each one of them can reduce your probabilities of closing round.
We talked about kind of first impressions a lot. What's the best first impression you've had of a founder? What have they done that kind of made you just automatically, fall in love with them?
I mean, I think there's nothing quite like meeting somebody who's really passionate about what they're building and doing. I mean, I think we both, Kate, have been in plenty of meetings where you get the vibe that this isn't just about, and it's not a fake thing. This is why we spoke about authenticity. It's not that you're getting fake vibes of energy. you're getting like a legitimate interest in what's being built and why. And it doesn't have to come across like some sort of high energy output, like a typical example of like Instagram, like, oh, I'm so good. It's not like that. It's just genuine. And there's this genuineness to it that you're like, wow, that's really cool. I want to work on this problem with you. And I think that's the ultimate connection builder. It's like, I feel like I want to work this with you because you're so passionate about it that I cannot help but want to help you succeed.
Totally, 100%. Carlos, we a lot of times think about how to win companies over and how to distinctly share Seedcamp's value proposition, right? How do we make them understand that we might be their best possible investor at this stage? If if you were to talk to a founder, kind of advising them on how to DD their investor, what advice would you give?
So we do cover part of this in the book. And to some extent, I think that that's flipped a little bit, right? Because now you're probably doing some research on the outbound about who you're going to talk to. So in theory, you already know, right? By the time you're engaging with them. But let's pretend for a second that you kind of know well enough. But on the flip side, you now want to do a little bit more. I mean, for one, there's a lot of questions you can ask during your meeting with them. I mean, you should definitely have some questions prepared for the investor, particularly if at the end of the meeting they say, hey, do you have any questions for us? It's a good opportunity to get to know the team, how they work together, what the process is, who are you going to be working with the team if they do invest, how do they work with companies, how long they work with companies for, is it for the life of the company, is it for a period of time, do they invest follow-ons afterwards? I mean, there's a whole series of questions you can ask about the journey. You can always reach out to other companies that they've invested in and then just get a genuine opinion. I mean, you can always ask for intros, but you can also just reach out and be like, hey, by the way, I'm looking at taking money from these guys. What do you think? And so those are all little triage things that you can do to figure out whether it's somebody you want to work with. And ultimately, you also have to calibrate, is this person the right person for me to be in a marriage with, right? And the reason why I use that word is because some of the relationships can last a long time. And then as with marriages, and anybody who knows me well knows that I only have a short-term experience with giving any kind of statements about marriage here. But the funny thing about it is that from what I understand, it evolves with time, right? It evolves with time, and that nature of that relationship changes. So you need to understand the expectations that investor has as that relationship changes. And I'll be very precise with an example. Your pre-seed investor is probably not going to be the expert about IPOs. But if that pre-seed investor has an expectation to be the expert and to remain on governance bodies all through the life cycle of your company without your consent, that is an interesting thing to lean in on. Because there are some investors who might have some authority in stating that. Let's pretend that they say they swap out different partners to do that. And others might just think they do, and they really don't. And so that's an example of what I mean by understanding what expectations they have for the relationship as it evolves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I think that's one of the most underrated aspects of an investor, the humility of, when to do something and also when to step back, when to know you're actually not the right person for that founder, at that specific stage of the company's life cycle. Let's talk about preemptive rounds. I feel like we've seen more and more preemptive rounds kind of at the pre-seed stage, but then also notably at the Series A stage. Talk us through what preemptive rounds are and whether they are worth considering for founders.
So preemptive rounds, there's two types, the ones you want and the ones that are sort of suggested to you. So I think that the ones that are suggested to you are very flattering because you might not need the money. And so it's just a question about whether you can see yourself having a credible story to use that money wisely and to move faster. And if you do, then hey, it's probably worth considering. If it's not destructive to the cap table and if it's something that your existing shareholders agree with, hey, more money allows you to go faster, provided that it doesn't break that previous point we made about toxic rounds. Last thing you want is to take an inbound convertible uncapped note at like 100 million when you're a seed company, and then all of a sudden you don't exactly know what to do with it. So that, there's a whole discussion there, there's a whole thread there. Then there's the ones that you want potentially and are usually a catalyst by some sort of negative event. It's sometimes they're positive events, sometimes they're negative events. A positive event would be like you have an opportunity to enter a new market. And so you weren't intending on doing that before, but now you have the opportunity. And so the funds would allow you to do that. Alternatively, it might be that you're not in a particularly great financial state. Something might have happened. You might have lost somebody. You might have customers, POCs taking longer for it to turn into a client. And that's when, you're reaching out to get that extra money. And that's a very different circumstance. We can call those bridges, we can call those extensions, we can call them whatever we want, but they're a variant of this spectrum of rounds that are not necessarily the traditional, I'm going out raising. And you might not be ready, you're not in your ideal state to go and do that.
Mm-hmm. The experience I've had with a few companies at this point is that they get excited, and this is the good side of a preemptive round, but they get excited about an investor's interest. They're not really ready to fundraise, but this investor is a perfect fit for them. The risk, or the thing I see a lot, is that actually wastes a ton of time for founders. So you end up going in this month-long kind of journey of seeing whether you're the right fit for this investor. You spent a ton of time on this. The investor then says, hey, actually, it's a bit too early. It's not the right time. And then the founder has wasted a lot of time, which they could have repurposed for go-to-market efforts, product efforts. What advice do you have for founders who are stuck in this position? They've got an exciting opportunity to pursue a preemptive round, but they don't know whether it's gonna, in the end, waste their time.
Yeah, so this is why it's important to calibrate that, because the nature of the preemptive round matters, right? For example, if you're in a distress situation, you can't really work on your product anyway without having to go out and do this. So you're requiring a preemptive round, and preemption meaning that it's before I'm using the strict definition of that word. You could call it a bridge, but it technically falls within that. So on the one extreme of your question, you're kind of forced into it. Then there's a sort of medium where you don't need to, and it's a good point. Sometimes it can be a distraction. It can be a distraction because it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you will be successful. Now, where it gets really weird is if you get a preemptive offer from an investor that you may have not otherwise wanted to talk to. This is where it gets weird, where let's say this investor is not particularly relevant, or it's not particularly kind of in the space that you're interested in, but they're very keen on what you're building for whatever reason, and maybe legitimate reasons. You then think, okay, should I be going to talk to a whole bunch of other people? Because if this person's interested, maybe these other people that are more relevant would be interested. And now all of a sudden you get sucked into this process that you weren't intending to, which is effectively what you're kind of alluding to, is you then get stuck in this process that is counterproductive. And you may get all these rejections from the people you really wanted. And it was all triggered unexpectedly because of this one person who you kind of maybe not so interested in. There is a calibration point there, and there's no right answer. It's literally, you get something, think about it. Is this person I want to take money from? Is it worth the time to go look elsewhere or not? Is this good enough? Is it going to help me? Do my shareholders agree? If they agree and it's good enough, take it, move on. If the shareholders are questioning it, you're kind of questioning it, maybe you pass, right? Especially if you're not in distress, why bother? Because there is a risk that you go out to all these people. Now, if you have one or two or three of those that are kind of maybe not as concrete as that one, but they're kind of more soft, so that there's a possibility, then what you can do is just reach out to them and be like, hey, by the way, like, you still interested? And what does that look like? And so there's a lot of calibration here. And I think that it's wisdom that you have around your shareholder base, your investors, your pre-seed investors, that will help you calibrate that accurately. So ultimately it comes down to a calibration moment, and the people you have around you are the ones that can help you calibrate better.
Last question for me, Carlos. Where can listeners find your book?
So listeners can find my book on either the Fundraising Field Guide website which has links to Amazon, Apple, Kobo, and every other platform that exists, or directly on Amazon. And you can order a paperback, and you can, I think we'll have a method to get hardcovers, although it wasn't optimized for hardcovers. But and the last place you can get it is on the charitable donation site, which is a lot of the proceeds of this book. Sadly, Amazon take their cut, and others do as well. Goes to a charity called Resurgo Spear, and it's a charity that helps young people across the UK get a leg up on their careers. And so, it's somebody that I've been working with since the beginning, version 1. And so that is probably the most efficient way from a perspective of donation, but probably the least friendly way from the point of view of getting an EPUB file from Amazon directly on your Kindle. So yeah, those are the best ways you can get the book.
Nice. Carlos, thank you so much for your time. Super, super insightful. And yes, there's threads to all of the conversations that we started that can continue in the book. So listeners, do please give it a read.
Thank you.
Thank you.